talking here. Jeff, you also noted some nuggets as it relates to Jalyn Armour-Davis. So let's start there and get a little deeper. Jalyn was a 4th-round pick. They had a slew of them back in 2022. Pepe Williams was his classmate at the cornerback position, and now both players are no longer with the organization. We'll see what happens to JAD with the waiver and whatnot. But this is a player that when you look at his availability or lack thereof over the last 3 seasons, Jeff, you got to think that they were either one, willing to go in a youthful movement, or 2, or both, just not willing to, acknowledge that right now, in the here and now, the medical might be good, but what's going to happen in a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now?
Yeah.
Maybe that's just something they weren't willing to gamble on based on recent seasons.
Yeah, I think that's the tough part. He was pretty healthy this summer. Unfortunately, first of all, he's one of the best dudes in the locker room. So, I would be shocked if he doesn't get claimed. I know we overuse that often, and, so few players whine. I think they've had like 3 players claimed in the last 5 years. So I wouldn't, I don't make any guarantees, but I just a cornerback with those measurables, who's from a program like Alabama, has played for the Ravens and put up really good tape this summer at a position where everyone is looking. I would be surprised if he doesn't get claimed. But look, guys, what didn't happen? He didn't get traded. And if they cut him, they were shopping him hard. And that goes to show you that teams were weary of his injury history too. I mean, that's sort of what held him back around the league. That probably prevented them from not getting a trade where they recouped a 6th or 7th round pick for him. And that ultimately has to be in their back of their mind, because he's played good football in stretches before, but then the injuries inevitably come. It's a shame for a talented kid, but that's just the reality of it. And I think the last thing they wanted to happen was to keep him and then release one of these younger guys, a Higgins or a Keon Martin or a Ruben Lowry, release one of those guys, have him get claimed, and then Jalyn Armour-Davis gets hurt covering one of the first kickoffs of the regular season, and suddenly you're out both players. So they opted to go younger. Jalyn Armour-Davis is a free agent after this year, so I can't imagine there are any plans to re-sign him depending on what happened this year. So it's kind of moving away from him a year early in order to keep a younger, cheaper player in the organization. I personally thought he earned a roster spot, and I'm always weird. I would always be hesitant to cut a young corner who can play and has those measurables. But it's not hard to see why they did it. It's all about the injuries, and unfortunately, that's one thing he hasn't been able to dodge since he's been in Baltimore.
Yeah, and I think if you go look at Jalyn Armour-Davis's film, he was probably the most consistent corner, at least for the outside corners in this preseason. So it was truly shocking. It was kind of funny. I had all the clips set up. I was actually going to do a video today on Jalyn Armour-Davis, just because I thought he was a lock. And to see them move off of him, it really does come down to the injury piece. And it really comes down to, how many deep can you go at outside corner? I know the Ravens are going to want extra depth, especially on their practice squad, with Jar Alexander and Awuzie, who are already kind of, dealing with some injuries in camp. So they're going to be worried about that. And he's going to have to adjust to that. So I'm really excited to kind of see what this corner room can do. And it sucks for Armour-Davis, but, I think Brian McFarland put it up. The claim rate across the NFL is 13%. So 13% of guys that get put through waivers get claimed. So Jalyn Armour-Davis could be back on the practice squad. I do think he'll be claimed because of the preseason he put together and, the potential there, but, it's not necessarily a lock. So I'm still holding out a little hope that we can get him back, because I would like to have that depth.
I've been leaning on this, to your point, and this is from Nick Cordy a couple summers ago, but along those lines of statistics and the waiver game that all these teams play, when constructing and really cutting, they're trimming from 90 to 53, as we know. I thought this was a good reference point from the summer of 2023. And Nick wrote that out of 851 players cut 2 summers ago, according to Over the Cap, only 24 of those were claimed off waivers, and that's a percentage of 2.82. And he goes on to summarize, a regular lesson for fans to learn when they're worried about their favorite fringe roster players on their favorite team being lost to waivers is just how rare it happens. And then I have just over the last several years, maybe this is what you're referencing, Cole, from Brian, Ravens salary cap analyst, kind of just recounting who those players were since 2016 that the Ravens lost that were claimed on waivers. So again, 2.82%, Jeff, you feel pretty comfortable about it. We'll see what happens with JAD, but I think the Bo Braids of the world will be back, and there'll be others too.
Yeah, I mean, that's always how it works. And Ravens typically are considered one of the organizations who has one of the strongest, deepest summer rosters. So people tend to look. So you'd think that would lead to some claims. Would it, people are looking for offensive linemen and defensive linemen and, cornerbacks. Those are the positions where the demand far exceeds the supply. And, there's, could a guy like Garrett Dellinger get claimed, a rookie 7th round pick who played a good bit against Washington? Sure. Okoye, the nose tackle. I think he's a little raw. I don't think he played that well the last 2 preseason games, but he's a huge man, and he's now been part of the Chiefs and the Ravens. And could he get a look as a rotational guy? Sure. So they could lose a guy or two, but that's what happens. I mean, that's the part of having a deep roster. And one thing I want to get to, guys, is, it's kind of been a running joke around the league about the Ravens in these preseason games and their winning streak. And obviously that ended, but they won all 3 this year again. But they win these preseason games is not because they play starters, because they don't. They play, 5 starters the entire preseason. It's not because John Harbaugh game plans for it or coaches like it's the regular season, because he doesn't. It's because their player personnel staff finds good young players. There's a culture here where they're competing hard for jobs and they get an opportunity, so they're extremely motivated. And their position coaches do a heck of a job in coaching these guys up and getting them ready to play. And we see it time and time again how much better their second or third stringers are than the teams they're playing in the preseason. And that's why they win in the preseason, because those are the guys who play a lot. So I think those are the strengths of the organization, right? The Harbaugh, how he's kind of instilled this culture and this competition and all that, and how their personnel staff finds talent and how their coaching staff develops it. And that's always on display in the preseason. And we saw that in Washington on Saturday. I mean, that was varsity versus JV for much of that game. And it was so obvious how much deeper the Ravens roster was than the Commanders roster in a game where neither team were playing their top guys.
Yeah. And, again, I think this practice squad is going to fill out really nice. And, 2 guys that I want to give a big shout out to, because I thought they played extremely well through the 3 games, were D'Ernest Johnson and Lucas Scott, the fullback, out at Army, Navy, one of the academy.
Army, yeah.
Army. Yep. And, Lucas Scott he played quite a bit and really played that kind of Pat Ricard H-back role where he's not just playing as a traditional fullback, he's moving around, and he's a former offensive lineman, and he's kind of built the way Ricard is. I don't think he's quite as heavy, but it's just fun. Yeah, seriously. That guy, they got Diet Ricard over in Los Angeles with John's brother, but they just don't build them like that. But I always find it fun to watch these guys, the Ravens, go out and find that kind of fit these archetypes that they have on their roster. And Lucas Scott's definitely that type of guy. And what I'm really hoping to see from him is to try and develop some of that inline tight end ability. That's something that Pat Ricard did over his first few years. And I know he gets listed as a fullback or a running back, but he really plays more kind of tight end and inline, helping out with pass protection, chips off the edge, that sort of thing. So I think it's really exciting to see that. I think he's a guy that's going to, he's going to be a factor in the future. I think they're going to try and keep him around. And Pat Ricard, he's getting up there in age, right? So, he might be looking at retirement soon, and they might be looking at to develop a guy like this for the next couple of years to kind of take over. And then I just thought D'Ernest Johnson, was the type of guy that ran hard, played very sound football. He's playing with kind of the third string offensive line. So, those holes are hard to come by at certain points. And, they kept 4 running backs. And I think that's probably because they're worried about Keaton Mitchell long-term injury-wise. That's why they want Rasheen Ali on the roster. So, having practice squad running backs, I think is going to potentially matter eventually if they want to go with 4 running backs. So, big shout out to him. I do hope he kind of comes back on that practice squad.
Cool story though, guys. Real quick, Bobby. Who's Army's coach, right? Jeff Monken. Who's the Ravens offensive coordinator? Todd Monken, the cousin of the Army head coach. That is why Lucas Scott is here. They kind of sold him on a vision. They know him well. You use your contacts to get in players. And I totally agree with Cole saying. And while they seem confident that, Ricard's going to be back from a calf injury or what he's dealing with now by week 1, I don't know that it's a lock at the moment. And with likely also potentially not playing in that game, they may need another fullback or a tight end up for that game in week 1 in Buffalo. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think pretty Card will play week 1, but don't be surprised if Lucas Scott factors